Welcome to Living Rock Sermons, a place where we bring the transformative power of the Sunday message to your ears. Each week, we bring you a sermon from our most recent service filled with insights, inspiration, and guidance to help us navigate life's challenges and deepen our connection with God. Whether you're joining us from the comfort of your home, on your daily commute, or during a quiet moment of reflection, we are honored to have you as a part of our digital community. Together, we'll embark on a meaningful exploration of faith guided by the wisdom shared from the pulpit. This podcast serves as a bridge, uniting us in a shared experience of worship, reflection, and growth. So get ready to open your hearts and minds as we dive into this week's sermon.
You know, we hear a lot today on the internet about algorithms, computers that are monitoring where you click, what you watch, what you see, and then making sure that you continually get fed that information. How many know that's true? Hopefully no one's ignorant of that anymore. We understand that anybody that uses a computer, whatever you Google, if it was a pair of shoes last week, suddenly you're going to be inundated with shoes. If you Google something on the national scene or international scene, suddenly you're going to find that you're being sent stuff. And I want you to know that I think a gathering like this on a Sunday morning is unique. And I'll tell you why I think it's unique, because pastors, at least the way I was raised and trained, are still required by the Lord to get before the Lord and to seek His face about what they're to bring the congregation that they serve. In other words, you don't just find out what's popular, what's the 10 best hits, and make sure you're preaching the 10 best hits. You don't just go with what's sometimes contemporary in the culture. So it's something I've always tried to do, is to ask the Lord, God, what is it you want to say to this congregation? After all, this is the people you called me to. And I'm going to ask something of you, whether you want to or not, is to simply trust me that I do that on a weekly basis, that I pray and I ask the Lord to guide my Bible reading and my study, and that I'm asking God, Lord, what is it that our church needs to hear? And sometimes, if it's really difficult, then I try to do a little diagnosing myself and try to, where are people needed? Where are they confused? Maybe where they lack some understanding or doctrinal, and try to feed that. Because after all, pastors are called to teach, not to just preach. So having said that, that's kind of what brought me into this study here with you, what I'm calling the shadow of the cross. Because I feel as though some of these wonderful truths of Christ get lost in all the noise of our lives. The first one we talked about a couple weeks ago was redemption or ransom, that we've been ransomed. The second one we talked about last week was adoption, being sons of God, and that not everybody is a son of God. We all understand that, right? I mean, we all have our existence from God in that sense, but only to them who believe did He say have the right and privilege to become children or sons of God. I believe, it's my conviction, that if our faith is not about healing and salvation of the soul, then it really doesn't have much to offer people. If what we preach on a Sunday morning is not about healing, it's not about salvation of our souls, then we really don't have much to offer. You'd be better off joining a local community group. Some of them do a much better job sometimes in social work than the church does. The very word salvation means healing. The Greek word salos, salvation, healing. And I believe that when the glory of Christ is explained and the power of the cross and resurrection are understood, then there's not only power to live in this life, but our lives become attractive to the unbelieving world. As Paul said, I choose nothing but to know Christ and Him crucified. The preaching of the cross, he said, to them that are saved, or the being saved, is the power of God unto salvation. Paul felt that the attraction of Christ was worth everything, even his very own life. He said, I count all things lost. That meant his reputation, his religion as a Pharisee and Jew, being of the tribe of Benjamin, his heritage. He said, I count all that as nothing, and I press forward toward the mark of the prize of the high calling in Christ Jesus. We wonder sometimes why our churches are not filled and overflowing. And I would say it's because we're not preaching Christ. Because Christ is attractive. He said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me. And we can get sidelined and distracted into preaching a lot of things that have very little to do with bringing His kingdom to earth, that have very little to do with healing people's souls and allowing them to experience the same redemption that you've experienced, the same forgiveness that you've experienced, the same adoption as sons and daughters that you've experienced. So I want you to turn to a text this morning. It's one, believe it or not, I have really never preached on, at least parts of this chapter before. But I have preached on some of it. At least it's been mentioned, I know, in other sermons. But turn to Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. If another member of the church, or if your brother sins against you, reading from the English Standard Version, if your brother sins against you, tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you and you have gained your brother, but if he does not listen, then take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Well, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Then Peter came up and said to him, verse 21, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. And when he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. And when his fellow servants saw that what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. They went and reported to their master all that had taken place. And then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Now, I want you to notice right here at the outset, because we read the entire context, this teaching on forgiveness is not all of the teaching there is on forgiveness, but this particular teaching on forgiveness is the hallmark of what is to be authentic life and community as the church. In other words, forgiveness is supposed to characterize us as a community. It's supposed to be how we live with one another. It's supposed to be a discipline that as a community we practice. Because our Christian life, as the story unfolds, we realize was really born in forgiveness. And because we have been forgiven, we have to, or we're required to live and reflect that forgiveness in our relationships one with another. Now, we all share this common nature that we find it hard to forgive. In fact, sandwiched in this text, we didn't read it, but just above the text that we read, Peter has come to Jesus and he's asked about his brother Andrew. He says, how often do I got to forgive Andrew? He doesn't say it by name, Andrew, but he says, how often do I got to forgive my brother? He's not talking in context of the church. The church isn't a community that Peter really even understands yet. So he's asking it, how often do I need my brother? And Peter thinks he's being generous. He says 7 times. Because the rabbis only required you to forgive 3 times. So Peter's thinking, I'm going to really be benevolent here. I'm going to say 7 times. My stupid little brother. And Jesus says, no, you need to forgive him 70 times 7. Means, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you say, okay, it's been 489 times, and you've been keeping a record. It means that forgiveness is something that's supposed to be ongoing. It's just supposed to kind of flow out of us. It's just supposed to be the habit of way believers function in community with one another. Now, I think Jesus is putting his finger on what he knows will become a serious problem within this little community that he would call the ecclesia, the called out ones. In other words, Jesus is telling us in this story, if we fail to open up about the wrongs that we've committed one to another, and if we fail to forgive others when they occur, then who are we? Who are we? In the world, what we oftentimes see is people just ignore wrongs when they happen. It's easy to cancel people. It's easy to delete them, to block them, to just remove ourselves. We don't want the confrontation, so you know what? I think I'll just bow out. We just leave the relationship. We move on. Or we might try to seek justice, or we've just become a person who will tolerate the injustice, and we see that as well. But I'll tell you this, and Jesus gets at this, which is very important in the text. Resentment is a deadly disease for any relationship. And it cannot and should not exist within God's community. So here Jesus, in fact, I think resentment, unforgiveness are the basic problem behind some people's spiritual dryness, behind backsliding, because unwilling to confront or unwilling to forgive. The parable that Jesus gives us, I think, is meant to jar us into a kind of a reality here. Remember when David had sinned and by taking another man's wife, and Nathan and he's covered this whole thing up with a murder, and everything's fine as far as David's concerned until the prophet comes one day. His name is Nathan, and says to David, sir, there's a man who he had plenty of flocks, but he went over to this poor man's farm, and he only had one lamb, and he took it for himself. And this was a lamb that was like a child to him, and he what should be done for such a man like this? And David says, well, the man should be arrested. He should be punished. And then Nathan, like cold water, throws it on David and says, well, you are that man. And all of a sudden, David, it hit him that, oh my gosh, I took another man's wife. And he was jarred into reality. Sometimes we can't see ourselves until we hear a story that all of a sudden, our sense of justice rises up, or our sense of injustice rises up. And because we heard it told to us in a way that, and then we realize, oh my gosh, that's me. This is what Jesus is doing here with this parable, with this story. And what Jesus seems to be telling us in general here is that if our relationships are not right in the church, then nothing else goes right. Now, you're already, why is Pastor going to be talking about this? Is he going to tell us something? No. I'm telling you this because it's in the Bible. I'm telling you it because you need to put this in your pocket and remember it, because you're going to be tested. That's why I'm preaching it. You're going to be tested. You're going to have to walk at this out somewhere, somehow, with somebody. Forgiveness is important, so I want to talk about why it's important, because Jesus tells us why it's important. He also tells us what it is, what forgiveness is really. And then he tells us how to do it. First of all, let's look at the end of the passage, because the end of the passage really kind of tells us why forgiveness is important. It says, because when the forgiven man is not forgiving, and he became vindictive instead, it says, in anger, the master delivered him to the jailers, that he should pay all his debt. And the word jailers there is, some translations put it as torturers, because jailers were oftentimes tortured those whom they were watching and keeping charge over. And Jesus then says, so my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. That's why it's important. It's not saying that you're going to go to hell if you don't forgive. But it's not saying you're going to go to heaven if you do forgive. Because we know the Bible teaches over and over that we're not saved by our works. It's just like in Matthew 25 when Jesus called the sheep and the goats together, and he started to separate them, and he told the story that you gave me water when I was thirsty, you gave me something to eat when I was hungry, and he says, when you did it to the least of these, you did it also unto me. It's not that caring for the poor is going to get you into heaven, or if you don't care for the poor is not going to is going to send you to hell. It does mean this, that if you close your heart to the poor, it proves you've closed your heart to Jesus. If you close your heart to someone who's asking for forgiveness, then you're closing your heart to Jesus. That's what it means. It's funny how what Jesus is saying is the same music that you've heard, you've got to be able to play to somebody else. You've heard the music of forgiveness. You've heard the song, thy sins are forgiven. You've heard it and you've enjoyed it, but now play it to somebody else. In the text, the forgiven failed to forgive. That's what this is about. The forgiven failed to forgive. So you have to wonder, was his heart really ever open to forgiveness? Because there's no way to tell if a tree is healthy except by its fruit. Some years ago, George Barnett planted some fruit trees in our property. It's amazing. I watch these trees. I park over near them. Last year, apples galore. They were everywhere. I watched deer from my office window, standing on their hind legs, just having a party, picking apples, calling their friends, just sharing, and apples everywhere. Shirley made a pie from those apples. Other people made pies from those apples. Look at them this year. There's not a thing on those trees. Something's making them not healthy. See, there are things in our own lives that when they pop up, they're an indication of poor health. poor health. You stay angry at somebody, or you refuse to forgive them. Why do we do that? Because we feel so righteous about it. Because we spend time justifying ourselves. Well, this is why I'm angry. This is because what you did to me. And when you're wronged by someone, you and I become very self-centered because we want it to go our way. And you continue to believe that you're owed something. If you believe the gospel and hold a grudge against someone, spiritually speaking, Jesus says you're in jail then. You're in jail. Every once in a while, you hear a story, maybe you've heard it yourself, where you invited your neighbor's kids to church. You said, "We like your kids play with their kids, and you want to when they come to church with your kids on a Sunday, and so you go next door and politely ask the neighbor, listen, our kids been playing together. They'd like to come to church with us," and the father or maybe the mother says very sternly, "No. My parents made me go to church. I will never make my kids go to church." Do you see what's happening there? That man's in jail. He's imprisoned by his unforgiveness toward his parents for making him do something that he didn't want to do. And now he's acting that out with his own children. That's the kind of prison I'm talking about. When we don't forgive, that person we're not forgiving continues to control us. And it's a form of torture. Frederick Buechner, a Christian author, said of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontations still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you're going to be giving back. In many ways is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that when you're wolfing down, what you're wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. So that's why forgiveness is important. But what is forgiveness? Forgiveness it's getting rid of the debt. You have to forgive the debt. In other words, you feel you're owed something. And the amount of what is forgiven by this king is enormous. Let me just put it in perspective. Some estimate that what the king forgave here was close to, in our contemporary economy today, of $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Who did the person owe? He owed the king. So the key to understanding forgiveness as children of God, which we are, is the size of our debt. Do we have any idea as to the size of our debt? A denarii, as was mentioned here in the text, was a day's wage. An annual salary was 300 denarii. A talent was 5,000 to 10,000 denarii. How, you wonder, could a person lose so much? Because you're thinking that this guy is a master, and this is one of his household servants, a gardener, the butler, or somebody like that. And that's not what it is here. This guy is a king. And in Jesus' day, there were no such thing as public funds. Oh yeah, people were taxed, but they paid taxes to Caesar. It was Caesar's money. There was no such thing as a budget in Jesus' day to be voted on. There was no such thing. It was all Caesar's. You say, who paid for the bridges? Caesar did. Who paid for the roads? Caesar did. How did he pay for it? Well, he had other people, satraps, local governors, who collected taxes for themselves and also to give them to Caesar. And that's what's happened here. That's how the amount grew to be so much. And it's either one of two things. It's either misappropriation of funds or it's complete corruption. We don't know which it is yet, but we will know. The story tells us. The debt's phenomenal. In fact, this debt that Jesus describes here, that this servant owed the king, was the annual income of Galilee, Judea, and Samaria, and Idumea all put together. It's amazing. He lost so much money. So what does the king do? He says, I'm going to take your family. But what does he do instead? When the man pleads for mercy, all of a sudden the king has pity upon him. He has pity upon him and he says, the debt's canceled. But as I explained to you in the sermon on redemption and ransom, that doesn't mean that it's just canceled. Somebody had to pay. The money had to come from somewhere. That's what redemption is. It's payment. Because there's always a cost when somebody does something wrong. Someone has to absorb the loss. And for you and I, only a sinless Christ, only God's Son, could absorb the debt of humanity. Only the God-man could do that. Colossians 2:14 says, He has blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, taking it out of the way, nailing it to His cross. Because you see, what's being described there is also another custom that when you had debts, what they would do with your debts, they would nail your debts. If you didn't pay your electric bill, you didn't pay your tax bill, whatever, it was nailed to the front door of your house. So everybody could see, this man's a debtor. But once in a while, someone with a generous spirit, maybe even the person you owed the money to, could come by and just write his name on your bill. And that meant that the debt was canceled. That from that point on, if you have anything else to put onto this man, you put it on this account over here. Paul does that with a servant that Onesiphorus, in his letter, he says, if he costs you anything, put it on my account. I'll take care of it. That's what ransom is. That's what redemption is. That's what forgiveness is. It's taking the debt. God has canceled the record that was against you. The one that listed all the rules you failed to follow, the one that listed all the things you thought about and promised to do that you never did. And yet what we see here in the parable is that the forgiven does not forgive. Instead, he goes out and finds someone who owes him just a small fraction of what he owed and begins to choke him. Now, I think that's pretty dramatic. He begins to choke him. You know, when people don't forgive, I'll tell you what a tortured soul looks like. Someone who can't forgive, they may root for something bad to happen in the person's life that they can't forgive. They're looking for anything they can find on the internet or on their Facebook. They still have their job. Does someone get sick? This is how this thing works. You start rooting for bad things to happen. Why do you want that to happen? Why would someone do that? Because you're trying to cancel the debt. You want them to pay. Somebody has to pay. And if you're not going to pay, then you want them to pay. So you imagine these kinds of things. You start savoring anything that goes wrong in that person's life. And once you feel they've suffered enough and you feel they've paid enough for what they did to you, you might release them. That is not the way of Jesus Christ. You've got a chokehold on them. The alternative is simply, you pay the debt. You refuse to tell them off. You refuse to think that way about them. Instead, you pray for them. You bless them. You say kind things about them. That's how you start paying down the debt, and you do that often enough and consistent enough. You start feeling differently about them. But there's more, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. Because when you start doing that, blessing them, saying kind things, and not wishing evil upon them, you now cut off the oxygen to your own self-pity. You cut off the oxygen to your own anger, and you'll start feeling differently. I'll say this right now, and you might want to write this down. You have to grant forgiveness before you feel it. You always have to grant forgiveness before you feel it. Forgiveness is an act of the will. This morning we had a beautiful worship service here. appreciate the worship team, and I know you do as well. And Jesus said this in Mark chapter 11, verse 25. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. So while you're in a place of worship and prayer, forgive. And of course you do. When Jesus' disciples asked him to teach them to pray, he said, pray this way. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. This is part of our communal life. Tonight, we're going to be doing something at Parmalee Farm that's not unprecedented, but it's unprecedented in recent memory for about the last 5 years, and that is local churches coming together to pray. To pray for the nation, to pray for the world, to pray for the church, to pray together. There'll be Catholic believers there. There'll be evangelical believers there. There'll be other believers, people who believe. Hate to even use the labels. Believers, people who care about Christ. Our brothers and sisters in Christ. But instead, this guy, instead of being happy about his forgiveness, instead of, going around and telling everybody how much he's been forgiven, he finds this guy that owes him 100 denarii. So the king starts realizing, because he gets word from servants, hey, sir, you remember that fellow that you forgave $1 trillion? Well, we just saw him choking somebody who owed him 100 denarii. And the king, he starts to realize, oh, this isn't about misappropriation of funds. This isn't some little accident. This isn't a mistake. There's corruption here. There's a problem in this person's character and in his heart. You see, some people just make mistakes and they're deeply sorry when they're given the chance to repent. And other people make mistakes and they keep making them because there's a real problem in their character. There's corruption. So the king goes back and he has this guy locked up. Now, I think about this guy. He must have been brooding over this 100 denarii for some time, even though he's squandering. He's brooding over this so that when he found the guy, he couldn't help but be violent toward him. Sometimes when forgiving someone, you realize at some point, wait a minute, this person keeps doing this a lot. He's hurt not just me, but he keeps hurting other people. So you say to yourself, for justice' sake, someone needs to stop him. But you got to be careful if you're hiding behind justice. Because sometimes people who are seeking justice are really seeking vengeance, trying to make someone pay. You're not doing it out of love anymore. You're never qualified to seek justice if you haven't forgiven first. Resentment's a horrible thing. In fact, in the Bible here, Jesus says, he calls him the wicked. He calls him a wicked servant. Because that's an attitude that's now captured him and enslaved him. Finally, this morning, the story that Jesus tells us gives us a pattern for just how to forgive somebody. And this will help you not just with your relationships with brothers and sisters in Christ, but really with any relationships you have outside the church family. How do you forgive someone? Here it is. Write this down, please. Identify with the person. Verse 27. Notice what it says about the king toward the servant that owed him $1 trillion. Out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. Do you see those words underlined? Out of pity for him. There's that word popping up again. We saw it a week ago with the word compassion in Psalm 139. Excuse me, 103. You know the most common emotion that the Bible talks about that Jesus exhibits? And throughout the Gospels, the most common emotion that Jesus exhibits is, and Jesus moved with compassion. He moved with pity. moving with compassion. It means that your heart goes out to them. So if your brother or sister sins against you or wrongs you in some way, you're supposed to go to them. You're moved with compassion. You go to them. You don't wait for them to come to you. It's how the Lord forgives us. His heart goes out to us. And notice how the debtor feels here in the story. He says at first, give me some more time. I'll pay it back. Be patient with me. Do you really think you could pay back $1 trillion? Do you think that you telling God, well, I'll start going to church, that's going to pay the debt? Is the fact that you say, well, I'm going to read my Bible more often, is that paying the debt? Of course it doesn't. I'll try harder, God. Does that pay the debt? The King forgives because he knows we can't pay the debt. We could never pay the debt. So how do you forgive? You have to identify with that person in some way. You have to do that serious internal work, reminding yourself, wait a minute, I'm not that different than so-and-so. I'm not that different than them. You see, when you want to be bitter at somebody, when you want to stay angry at them, then you have to characterize them in a certain way. How many of you we've been to the fairs? We've all seen the cartoonists at the fairs who for $15, they'll draw a picture of you. And what do? When they draw a picture of you, they exaggerate maybe your big ears. They exaggerate your nose or give you some lips, big lips. They make your body look funny. But you can still see it's you because they've taken what's the most distinctive characteristics about you and blown them up into a way that now it looks funny. That's what you have to do to a person you want to stay mad at. You have to say things like, oh, they're such a liar. They're a liar. They're nothing but a snob. You keep telling yourself that over and over and over again. They're stuck on themselves. Or they think they're so high and mighty. Keep telling yourself, you're characterizing. Well, do you ever lie? Have you ever lied? Well, yeah, but not that often, on occasion. Well, would you call yourself a liar? No, I'm not a liar, but I've lied. Why do we paint the picture of ourselves in such balanced ways, in such a beautiful portrait? Yet somebody else, big ears, big nose, big eyes. But look at me. See? You have to identify with them. Identify with them. That's the way your heart goes out to someone. You begin to say, they're a human being just like me. They've suffered. They've had loss. They've had disappointment. They've had failures. People that can't forgive exclude themselves from the community of sinners. But Paul reminds us, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Don't exclude yourself from the community of sinners. You might not do it the same way they did it, the same way they did it, but you're capable of it. You can only stay mad at somebody if you continue to remind yourself that you're better than they are, that you would never do that. If I were them, I would have never done this. You have to do that, or else, here's what happens. You get put in jail. You start being tortured by your anger. You start being, that's when you take someone out and you put them somewhere else, you're excluding them from community. They're excluded now from community. John says in one of his epistles, he says, those who went out from us, it's obvious they went out from us, they're not of us. That's the reason he gives. And it's in the context of they were not willing to walk in love. They were not willing to walk in the fellowship of what we've come to understand. That's what fellowship is. It is saying, brother, that hurt me. And giving that person a chance to say, I'm really sorry. That's not what I meant. Will you forgive me? And it can be that simple. But sometimes things go much deeper, and it takes longer. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't pray for opportunity. God, give me an opportunity that I can see that brother or that sister and be able to speak to them about this. And God will do it if that's in your heart to forgive them. He'll create the opportunity. He'll create the situation. And you'll recognize it when it happens, and you can step right into it with an open heart. So that brings me to the last part here. In Matthew 18, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to him, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, this seems pretty strong, and it is. In other words, the church is to hold us accountable for our relationships. And the church is actually a vital resource to help us in that. We don't have to do this alone. We can bring another person with us if at first we are unsuccessful. We don't bring them up in a prayer meeting. This is not addressing those who simply just like to complain. This is not what this is talking about. Or have an opinion that they want to have considered. Or even address something you think someone is doing that they shouldn't be doing. That's not what this is talking about. It's talking about when you've been hurt by someone, or you go and speak to them. Tell them their fault if your brother sins against you. Now, these words to this phrase, go and tell him his fault, those are what? 6 words there. Underline them, because here's why I want you to underline them, because that's the same word that Paul uses for evangelism. I think this is interesting. Go and tell him his fault. Evangexilo, same word for evangelism. Why? Because a person that is unwilling to forgive needs to be evangelized. And this is why the Bible is saying that you treat them as a tax collector or a publican or a Gentile. Why? Not mean you shun them. Some people have read this verse and they think, well, we have to shun that person. We have to boycott. We have to stay away from them. It's not what he's saying. He says treat them like. How did Jesus treat tax collectors and sinners? He loved them. So it can't be that he's saying that. What's he saying then? They're not behaving much like a Christian. And maybe for a season, they may not be worthy of the name Christian if they're not doing what Christians should be doing, which is to forgive. That's what he's saying, I believe. That repentance and forgiveness is how we believers straighten things out. We don't walk around in bitterness and resentment. We don't walk around mad and check out. We don't go on some website and start. We confront, work it out, so that our witness and testimony may glorify Christ. Jesus hung out with the publicans and the Gentiles. He's not saying shun them. He's saying they need to be evangelized again about the grace. Be reminded. Do you remember how much you were forgiven? I grew up with a lot of anger in my late teens because of my parents' divorce. I was very angry at my father for years. It wasn't until I could see my own selfishness and understand my father's selfishness that I was able to have pity for him and forgive him. As long as I was just the poor, rejected little teenage boy who didn't have a daddy, I stayed angry, I stayed bitter, I stayed mad. Are you hearing what I'm saying, church? But about 27 years old, I got tired of being tortured with that. I got tired of the jailer. I got sick and tired of feeling that way. And I found a way, and God helped me. He said, Ryan, you're pretty selfish, too. What your father did was just selfish. Well, I understand selfishness because I am very capable of that. I guess I'm the only one. You see, if that's where you have to start, then that's where you start in forgiving somebody. You identify with them. So in closing this morning, I'll be really brief. Have you remembered this morning somebody that you're in a kind of prison because of your resentment? Is there someone that has wronged you that you need to forgive? Are you able to identify with that person and feel any pity for them? If you can't, ask God for His help. This is very important, church. And I know this is maybe a tough message to hear, maybe not what you want to hear, but as I told you earlier, I'm a pastor. I'm responsible for telling you what the Bible says, and not just the top 10 favorite hits that'll get everybody jazzed up. But this is really important stuff because I've been pastoring now for 40 years. I've worked with churches, not only ours, but other churches. I've been called in to help settle disputes between elder boards and trustees. I've had to, sadly, let go some pastors that were not qualified and then bring healing in the church. I know what I'm talking about here. I know when change happens in any kind of organization that there's always resistance, and to navigate that with other churches. And I don't know how to do it because I'm so smart and so educated. I know how to do it only because I seek God's help. Because these are impossible situations that are hurtful, and people are upset with one another, always uncomfortable, but somebody has to do it. You as a parent know this, that when your children are fighting, you have to march back to their bedroom, sit little Johnny down with little Mabel, and say, now forgive her. Don't you do that as parents? Don't you say, now listen, you forgive her. You say, I'm sorry. You forgive me. And you do this as parents. You know what? We never outgrow needing those promptings. As hard as it is, but it's really for your own benefit. It's your get out of jail. It's your being free from, and you can live like that in a way that's now attractive. I know what you went through with that person. How did you do that? One of the questions I get asked by other pastors when they hear, you've been pastoring how long? I say 40 years. How did you do it? Simple. I learned to say I'm sorry. I learned to say I'm sorry, period. That's all you have to do. And mean it, obviously. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word this morning. I pray, God, that you will bless our hearing of it. I pray, God, that you will open our hearts to forgiveness. God, we are the forgiven. Our debt has been canceled on the cross. Our baptism witnesses that the handwriting of ordinances that was against us has been canceled. We are debt-free. Hallelujah. So God, help us to walk out that freedom with grace, with beauty, with mercy toward others, God. Beginning right here in the house of God and then outwardly, Lord. Let us flood the world with forgiveness. In a world with so much animosity and pain and judgment, let us flood the world with the forgiving love of Christ. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Living Rock Sermons. We hope that today's sermon has left a lasting impact on your heart and spirit. If you'd like to connect with Living Rock more, we invite you to visit our website, living-rock.org. There you can find information about our upcoming services, current events, and all of our ministries. Whether you're based in Killingworth, Connecticut, near the shoreline, or anywhere around the world, we welcome you to join our vibrant community. Stay connected with us on social media to receive daily inspiration, updates, and engaging content. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find us on YouTube as well. We're here to support you on your faith journey, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or prayer requests. Thank you again for tuning in. As we continue to grow together in faith, may God's love and grace fill your life abundantly. Until next time, take care, and may you find strength and peace in His presence.